Hello everyone, welcome. I am Paddy O'Connell and I'm hosting First Wednesdays, which have been proved to be very lively because we run them as a public meeting. So we are relying on you to speak up when you want to. I have an alleged structure in my mind, but it also involves ending on time. So I promise you it's not going to drag on with a bunch of boring people telling you what they think. This is very much a two-way situation, and welcome. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves with about a 1-minute biography, which is hard because they've all got a lot in their backgrounds, which is why we've come to listen to them. And when you have an opportunity, would you please say something about yourself? Specifically, you know, don't boast, but do let us know, because we've learnt that the audience here is part of the reason that we've all come as well. So please don't hold back if you've got experience that you should let us know. Immediately on my left, I have Christian, who will begin with introducing himself this evening.
Hi, I'm Christian Wisskirchen. I'm on the management committee of the Haiti Support Group, which is a pressure group that formed in 1992 here in London in response to the coup d'etat against President Aristide. And we've been working to help support participatory democracy in Haiti ever since. I personally also worked in Haiti for the United Nations as a human rights officer in the 90s.
And next door, Claire, would you give us both your names?
Claire Lockhart. I'm the co-founder of ISE, which is an organisation that looks at the questions of development and stabilisation in countries across the world, co-founded with Ashraf Ghani, who was the Minister of Finance in Afghanistan for a while, with whom I co-authored a book called Fixing Failed States, a misnomer because we think you can't fix them from the outside and they're not failed. And we look at lessons of successful transformations around the world and seek to share that knowledge with the 40 to 60 countries that are the most poor and unstable.
And to Astrid.
Hello, I'm Astrid Zweynert, Deputy Editor of AlertNet. AlertNet is a website that brings humanitarian emergency news and analysis to aid workers, governments, and the wider public interested in humanitarian emergencies and what is being done about them. It was first set up after the genocide in Rwanda with a view to improve the flow of information about humanitarian emergencies, and has been covering this ever since. And most recently we set up a new emergency information service as well, which is now in operation in Haiti, and it is bringing vital information to the affected population. So we're trying to reach out to populations affected by disasters, as well as giving information to people working in helping people.
Thank you. Peter.
My name is Peter Hallward. I teach philosophy at Middlesex University and wrote a book a couple of years ago on recent Haitian politics called Damming the Flood, which is a reference to Lavalas, the political mobilization in Haiti that took shape in the late 80s. And the book is mainly about how this popular mobilization was squashed, basically, how it was contained, divided, broken up, and what the consequences of that have been ever since.
And to Orin.
Hi, I'm Orin Gordon. I'm a broadcaster and journalist with BBC News and BBC World Service. I've been reporting Haiti for 10 years. If you Google my name in Haiti, there's a significant body of work that still resides online. My interest in Haiti is academic. I did Haiti as a subject for my master's degree. It's professional in terms of the reporting I've done. And it's personal. If you're Black and Caribbean, as I am, the Haitian Revolution of 1804 has a special place in your consciousness.
Well, that challenges me. Let me be honest. If you think you've got a chairman who knows everything about the 1804 revolution in Haiti, I'm afraid I'm here to be educated as well. Thank you all very much. We're delighted and look forward to what you've got to say. Unusually, we want to begin with a sort of grassroots feeling which has been expressed bluntly, that from the rubble has emerged a feeling of a neo-colonial sense of what's happening in recovery and rescue efforts. Some of you in the audience might be sympathetic to that, some of you may not. But in order to get our discussion going, we searched the web for people who do believe this. And up here, we head to Canada, where on the 25th of January, which is really very recently, Montreal hosted a conference to decide what to do next for relief. And in attendance was the Haitian Prime Minister, Jean-Max Bellerive. So you may think he didn't leave the country at the moment, but he has. He went to Canada. There were foreign ministers from our country and others there. And there were banks, there were organisations of all kinds. And in the demonstration outside, it's been posted what some of these people said, and we use it for a discussion point from the internet and what people are saying about what's happening there.
Outside the conference, community organizations and members of the Haitian diaspora in Canada questioned the U.S. military role in the relief efforts.
L'armée américaine, en contrôlant des points stratégiques tels que l'aéroport et les rues, empêche d'une certaine manière la distribution de l'aide. Par exemple, je vous dis que jusqu'à présent, il y a des personnes qui n'ont absolument, mais vraiment absolument rien reçu. Et là, c'est la grande majorité. Pourquoi? Qu'est-ce qu'ils attendent pour distribuer l'aide? Qu'est-ce qu'ils attendent?
Washington, Ottawa a utilisé l'événement catastrophique, une horreur humaine incroyable, pour justifier envoyer des dizaines de milliers de soldats. Haïti aujourd'hui a plus de soldats étrangers par square carré qu'il y en a en Irak, qu'il y en a en Afghanistan. Mais il n'y a pas de guerre en Haïti.
Last Friday, the U.S. signed a security agreement with the UN without any signature from Haitian representatives, allowing U.S. troops to operate outside of UN authority. There are now 30,000 foreign troops stationed in Haiti, including 20,000 American soldiers.
And I'm in favor of...
Okay, we're not going to show the whole thing. Let's begin with the panel from nearest me going down. There is concern that there is a neo-colonial force exposed in the devastation in Haiti. Would you explain briefly, as members of the panel, if you agree and why?
I don't think that there is justification yet to say that there is that the conspiracy theories there are true, that actually they just went in under the guise of trying to help, but really they want to occupy the country. Having watched Haiti, U.S. policy in Haiti for 20 years, I think we can see two major interests of the U.S. One is ensure no refugees arrive on the Miami shores, so that's some good reason to bring in lots of soldiers, from their perspective, to ensure that they don't leave. Secondly, to ensure that there is no political dissent, political revolution spreading from Haiti elsewhere. As we know, 1804, 1986, chucking out baby doc. Haitians are very independently minded, and I think there is that sort of fear. So I explain the large military presence partly in this way. I think that the Haitian government had a very difficult decision to take 2 days after a tremendous earthquake. There is not a great market in terms of who you call in with a logistical capacity to assist. I think now with hindsight, you might as well have called in somebody else, because very little aid is effectively distributed. So I don't buy quite into the conspiracy theory. I do buy into the argument that the US want to control Haiti, yes.
I think that's the key question is really to define what needs to be done, what's the task at hand, and who has the best capacity to do it. And the key tasks are decision-making, understanding, analysing the situation, working out what needs to be done, what needs to get to whom, as well as establishing the minimum order and security. And it seems that decisions were made, that the US military had a role in that. If those decisions were made again, maybe one would have looked to global logistics supply companies, sort of supply chain management companies, and that's the skill set that's really missing and is in demand. And I think we have to see this in a context that the UN agencies and civilian capacity, particularly in the US, is something that's under revision at the moment, and particularly in the tragic context that the UN agencies were one of the entities that were hit in the crisis.
Astrid?
I think it really remains to be seen in the reconstruction effort if the in reconstruction means the same mistakes are repeated and we create another culture of independence, of dependence in Haiti, then yes, perhaps one could criticize it as neo-colonialism. But I think in the immediate aftermath of such a big disaster, I don't really think the government had much choice but to allow the Americans some degree of control, for example, in running the airport. And I think what needs to be done in the future is hopefully to create a system whereby the UN agencies can become much more of a leader in that kind of capacity.
Yeah, I think the neo-colonial metaphor is quite good, actually. I think it's more, there was more than just logistical questions. I think what the striking thing about the immediate aftermath of the disaster is that the powers that be pushed a military and security agenda very hard. I mean, the U.S. took control of the airport, in fact, before they even had permission to do so. They started flying in their own troops. They diverted plane after plane full of crucial medical supplies, search and rescue teams, etc. In a way, more importantly, the resources that they did have, they used them according to a logic of where, what is secure. So what areas can be secured, in other words, with a perimeter, with soldiers and so on. In those areas, people went in to do search and rescue operations. So if you were following it, a couple of locations, and anyone who knows, been to Haiti will know them, the Caribbean supermarket, the Montana Hotel, the UN headquarters, that's where it went. And partly because these are places where you could put a fence and a bunch of guys with guns, and the people in those areas, mainly foreigners or wealthy Haitians, those are the people worth saving. The others, broadly speaking, were abandoned in the rubble. I mean, thousands and thousands of people. In my opinion, it was an absolute scandal. And for the same thing happened with hospital care. What hospitals were secured? In other words, which ones were close to the airport? Which ones could, be surrounded with troops? People from the Central Hospital in Port-au-Prince, for example, the General Hospital, were reporting that they were inundated with patients, no so-called security, therefore no supplies. It was outrageous. Have a look at there's a great report on this by Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman for Democracy Now!, I think on the 20th or 21st of January, with a Partners in Health doctor in the General Hospital. It's extremely revealing. He said, there are other hospitals which are in so-called security zones where you have 10, 20 doctors and no patients. It's a crazy situation. So this has happened. And I'll stop there, but there's a long trajectory. It's not an accident at all, if you ask me, that it happened this way, and I'd be happy to talk about that afterwards.
I think the thing to bear in mind about Haiti is that they've always had a security problem. This security problem predated the earthquake. So imagine there's a country in which virtually every functioning or every institution that's supposed to be fully functional is broken. The judiciary, the army, the police, the distributive mechanisms, the logistical mechanisms, the storage mechanisms. We had a country in that state before the earthquake. With the earthquake and with the collapse of buildings, the destruction of roads and everything, the simple logistics of moving around became very, very difficult. So for me, there was proper justification for improving the security in those numbers.
Okay, so let's head to the audience. The microphones around. Would anyone like to make a question, make a point before we move on with discussion among the panel? Yes, let us know, if you would, your name and to which of our panel you'd like to direct your fire.
Hi, my name's Chris King. My question really is the emphasis on making secure zones, and is that just not a consequence of the US military doing the thing that soldiers do? They're not necessarily trained for this kind of operation. So is the fact that they secure places and only let people into those, only do things in those secure places, just not a consequence of the fact you're using the military, rather than some kind of big conspiracy?
And who do you feel has an alternative view? Peter.
Peter, yes.
So, get your conspiracy hat off.
Sure,
they're
okay.
soldiers. They're logistical people.
Yeah. Well, that maybe would make sense if they did if in addition to securing these zones, they actually did some aid distribution. If you look at the places that were worst affected, particularly the neighborhood of Carrefour, which is a very poor suburb or part of Port-au-Prince, packed with people and was right, the closest part to the epicenter. No distribution whatsoever for 10 days. They could have easily got that. The logistics, in my opinion, actually were not that significant. They cleared the main roads pretty quickly. One of the biggest camps of people sleeping rough is right outside the National Palace in the so-called Champ de Mars. Yeah. That's smack in the middle of town. The main road from the airport goes right there. There was not, even now, if my friends of mine who go there basically on a daily basis say there's virtually no aid whatsoever being distributed. 10 days after, there was nothing. So it's not like they were going with maybe a slightly excessive level of political or military force because they were worried that things would get out of hand. They simply weren't going there at all. What they did is secure, they created a green zone in the airport. That's maybe what they do. That's what the U.S. military does. I agree with you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I must say I'm still more on your side, although I'm certainly open to argument about conspiracy from the U.S. side watching Haiti over the years. But on this point, there's absolutely no logic in terms of the U.S. government's objectives to incur that sort of negative publicity that is now coming out. I think there's a great deal of incompetence, and there's also a great deal of unjustified fear. This is what's been put out, and to some degree, I'm not sure whether you raise that word security in the right way. I disagree that there was a huge security problem, because we know that the Haitians are generally extremely peaceful.
Yeah.
They are not posing, and they haven't even the capacity, to pose a serious risk, to the U.S. military presence. There was 9,000 UN soldiers already in Haiti at the time, and if you look at what's coming out, there are very few people involved in effective aid distribution, but I think it's out of fear, out of an unjustified fear of security risks, and we saw Matt Fry standing there, saying there's violence all around me. Well, there was no violence, and the two images of violence that we saw on the screens were constantly repeated. There were the two same scenes of violence, for 5 days.
Notwithstanding the close affinity I feel with Haiti as a consequence of 10 years of reporting the country, making scores of friends and really liking the place, I can't say that the fears about security are unjustified. We don't have enough time to go into the personal briefings that we have had to get into in terms of keeping ourselves safe, in terms of going into certain no-go areas where you could lose your life. We don't really have time to get into that, but there was...
I do too.
I've walked into City today.
I'll give you a microphone.
Sorry.
Would you like to give your name?
Sorry, my name's Justin Griffiths-Williams. I'm a photographer. With respect, I think that's absolute
That's a better
rubbish.
way to put it, rather.
I get a little bit sort of wrought when it comes to Haiti. I agree with Peter and Christian. I think the security problem has been hugely over-exaggerated. From a personal experience, I spent 6 weeks in Haiti last year. I walked into Cité Soleil every single day on my own. I took local transport there. I never had any problems. My experience of Haiti, I've been going to Haiti for the last sort of 8 or 9 years, and I was there during the coup. I was there when it was extremely dangerous. I've had some incredibly difficult, dangerous times in Haiti, but the last 2 years has been as safe as I've ever known it. And I
would
really
dispute
do.
that.
You would?
Yes, I would dispute.
Well, as I say, from my experience, I literally worked in Cité Soleil, which is supposed to be the most dangerous place in Haiti. I worked there every single day. I caught public transport there. I walked around on my own without a guide, without a translator, without anything. I never had a problem. I can honestly say I've never known Haiti to be as safe as it's been in the last 2 years since they sorted out the kidnapping problem, which was about 2 years ago.
Well, I respect the fact that you've been into Cité Soleil on
I've been all over Haiti. I've been
on so many occasions. I myself have been all over Haiti. I myself have been into Cité Soleil, and I have to say, between 1990, when I first started reporting Haiti, and now, when I could travel around with relative freedom, the situation deteriorated. Look, I work for an organization, the BBC, that takes personal safety of its journalists very, very seriously. I could well have taken the risks that you did and gone into Cité Soleil as often as you did, and in the same ways as you did.
I'm not
but
a risk taker by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I'm not saying you are. I could have done that, but I would not have been allowed to. And my perception of covering Haiti over 4 visits in 10 years is that the security situation had deteriorated significantly. If you have a different view of that, that is fine.
Well,
I wouldn't characterize your different view as rubbish.
Yeah,
But,
maybe I was a little bit strident initially, but for example, I saw Orin Gordon's report from Cité Soleil. a couple of weeks ago, and I was absolutely appalled at the way she hyped the security risk over and over again.
Okay, now bear with me.
Sorry.
Just a second. No, you make the very fair point that you disagree with this analysis of security. But in the time that we've got, I just want to seek some other views. But I'm coming back to you. So we will be asking, I think, in a minute, about the reconstruction efforts. But just before we move on, we'll put this to bed with this question of the panel are giving their opinions on a conspiracy theory and why security has been raised. Is your point on this?
Well, I just sort of wanted to say something that supports what Orin was saying. It's just I've been itching here while hearing this word security being kicked around, being defined in a very narrow sense of physical safety. I think what Orin might have been trying to say as well, and he mentioned, this very weak institutions and the basic pillars of a society that we as citizens rely on to have a secure life in terms of security, not just from physical threats, but security from, poverty or lack of political representation and those sort of things. I think Orin is right in saying that these security problems existed in Haiti way before this earthquake, and in a very large sense, the repercussions of the earthquake are feeding into and magnifying this fundamental lack of what many call human security. So you're with the gentleman earlier. The army arrived. The army was already there, but they were boosted. Yes. That's what they do, and frankly, it's what they needed to do. I wouldn't say I agree, but I do. Well, you've got to say one or the other because we haven't got all night. Right. And let me just say that I think the military presence probably is justified to an extent, but the civilian input is very much missing. I think, which I don't know why we haven't learned these lessons yet. So you've got concerns about the army being there, but they're not conspiracy theories. No, I would agree with Christian. Okay, now to our two guests here who we've not allowed to speak for a long time. Here we are balancing some big questions about America's role, military, security, and we've heard that people do care about this. Would you urge us to concentrate more on relief and organisation, including working with the Americans? How critical would you say that is? And is this argument getting in the way? Is the argument that we are interested in and we are hearing, is it getting in the way right now? Is it costing lives? Claire?
Yes, I think we need to be very focused, or particularly those who are making decisions at the front line, on solutions, on making the best possible decisions in the moment on how to solve the problems, whatever they may be. And part of that is being able to read the situation, come up with the right analysis, and work out how to use the assets on the ground that are there on the ground, particularly given the constraints in transportation. We hear a lot about people not being able to get to the ground. So how to make use of predominantly the Haitian citizens, those on the ground, those who have the capacity amongst the aid agencies. And I think pragmatically, if there are 30,000, however many troops there are on the ground, what can they best be doing right now? And since they're American, who gives them orders? It's a question of the chain of command. I understand that it's the ambassador on the ground, the US ambassador, in concert, who is actually taking the decision. So there is a civilian control of the military. How it's actually working, I think we'd have to look at empirically. Astrid, the man who ran Italy's reconstruction efforts after their earthquake in L'Aquila 18 months ago, said that coordination has collapsed in Haiti. Is he wrong?
I think he's right, actually, and I think that's the big question, how can you actually coordinate the aid delivery better? Yes, the US soldiers weren't delivering aid, but that's not their primary role. There needs to be a better system whereby aid agencies don't just all rush in at the same time and don't talk to each other. And is that what's been happening? From the impression that I get, yes. Could you give us some examples? You run an information agency. I think I get daily examples of where I get emails where one aid agency says we have delivered so many packages of food today and yesterday and the day before. Then I get another one from another agency saying exactly the same, and you do sort of wonder why don't they talk to each other a bit more. And could you give us examples of what they're having to go through? Well, absolutely. I just wanted to read from an email that I got from Ryan McCrory, co-director of the Haitian Sustainable Development Fund today, saying NGOs, it's not been easy because of the extreme difficulty of passing through the myriad loops that the large NGOs require before anything will be given out. There is a 100-question form that they are passing out to communities to fill out and bring back in order to receive aid. This alone can take them a week or so. The questions they ask are
very difficult to answer, and explaining location in Port-au-Prince is nearly impossible. Often Haitians use directions like next to the large tree round the corner from so on and so market. The UN wants GPS coordinates because many streets are not marked here, and navigating the city has proven to be difficult. So it just goes to show, in my view, that there is a huge bureaucracy set up, and it is partly because I do understand that organizations might face, claims, if an aid worker gets killed or injured, that's right. But on the other hand, that's what organizations, aid organizations, and especially the military, are in the business of doing. And I was flabbergasted when I worked for the UN in '95. First briefing from the UN military unit there, which was headed by the Americans. Our primary objective here is force protection. And I thought, that's a bit odd. I thought the primary objective might be to help establish human rights and democracy. But no, the point is, we do not want to have any losses here. It's better that 100 Haitians die than 1 US soldier dies. Yeah? And that, I think, is a large part of the problem here.
Now, we'd like to go back to the audience at this stage. So we've heard that there is an argument which sensible people disagree on, but that it is also getting in the way. So wherever we in the audience may stand on that question, we've heard that it is getting in the way. I mentioned myself, I've interviewed one of the Italians who was involved in clearing up, which made 30,000 European people homeless. He says coordination is an abused word. So I would like to add my own experience in talking to people about this. He says coordination is an abused word. So if anyone would like to tackle this from the audience side, we're being presented this picture of massive need and a fractured international response, but a massive one. So if anyone could speak to that point and move us on, would you like at the end to maybe pass the microphone between you? There's two of you. We'll start with your friend right on the end, and maybe tell us your name and what your interest is or whatever your experience is.
Sure. My name is Lily Ryan Collins. I work with the Red Cross in the post-tsunami reconstruction effort. So I just wanted to ask members of the panel, maybe particularly Christian and Astrid, what happened to the cluster system? Because I thought the UN had developed the cluster system specifically to aid coordination in situations like this. So
would you like to tell us what you understand that to be, the cluster system?
The cluster system is basically a way of bringing together leading humanitarian agencies so that in a post-disaster situation, the coordination is much stronger than it has been in the past. Because I mean, you name any humanitarian disaster in the past 50 years, and coordination has been a huge problem. So the UN actually specifically, I think it was 2004, set up the cluster system to address that, but it seems to have completely not worked in Haiti.
Actually, the cluster system is working in Haiti, but the question is it effective in addressing the situation? So yes, they have daily meetings there, and it is operational, but I think it took quite a long time to set up in the first place, and it still doesn't really seem to lead to greater coordination on the ground on a sort of larger scale. I think there are meetings going on, and yes, the clusters are addressing shelter, food, public health, among other things, and that is a system that is in place. But I think it is part of a very large and cumbersome bureaucracy that the UN is, and that is part of the problem why it's taking a long time to get up and running.
Just on that point. Yeah, I think that's partly right. I think to some degree, I would accept that there are more delays than elsewhere in that we have that almost absent central state organizational system. The ministries all destroyed. In the tsunami, at least, you still had the capitals working. You could meet in ministries, and therefore, practical difficulties didn't exist that now do exist in Haiti. Otherwise, I have no explanation beyond that.
Could I ask you? It's a striking thing to hear you say. You're a member of our audience, that you worked for the Red Cross on the post-tsunami effort. I think if I could speak for all of us in the room, would you like to characterise for us how you interpret what's happening in Haiti, the reconstruction and relief, in your own words, because of what you've seen or how you worked? Put it in a sentence or two. What kind of progress is being made?
Goodness. Yeah, obviously the progress is very poor. To be honest, I was more involved in the sort of long-term reconstruction and the emergency relief in Sri Lanka.
You're still welcome to an opinion.
Okay. No, I mean, obviously it's very upsetting that the reconstruction effort is so disorganised and so slow. I do think that the fact that the US Army, is in there and is controlling the airport and so on has a detrimental effect. I'm quite sure that Naomi Klein would have something to say about this with her, with her shock doctrine theory. I really hope that things begin to improve soon.
If you'd pass the microphone along, and then I'll bring in other members of the panel.
Thanks. My name's Rebecca Stewart. I'm a development journalist for the BBC and The Guardian. And I'm no expert on Haiti at all. I know nothing about the history. I was actually in North Africa when this story broke. And I don't necessarily buy into the conspiracy theory of the states trying to take over Haiti, but I was really interested to hear that, there was a day where Hillary Clinton could land, but MSF couldn't. Which just seems insane to me. And I'm really interested in the way that the aid industry uses the media. And I was really interested in what Astrid was saying about she gets emails every day saying we've supplied X amount of food. And I was just really interested in where the media is kind of being played in this whole event and the panel's response to that.
And there's quite a lot of heads interested in that. Orin, would you like to answer that question? Is the media complicit in giving a message, right or wrong?
Yes, I think the media is complicit in some of the mistakes that have been made, because in some of the public information that has come out, what the media does is simplify things very, very much, and
do you do that?
I'd say we're all guilty of that. We try to present the story as simply as possible, and in the process of simplifying it, I'd agree that we sometimes oversimplify. That's quite strong imagery of Hillary Clinton being able to land and MSF not being able to. But that's just realpolitik. That's a recognition that the American government setup is much, much stronger than the aid delivery setup. And you're right to be outraged about that, but that is just the way things are. That is just the way things are.
Pretty obscene then, if that's,
it is
if that's the world we live in.
I agree with you.
Obscene.
I agree with you, it's obscene, but that's the way it is, yeah.
Peter?
I'd love to come back to this question about the conspiracy and so on, but maybe at the time you're choosing.
Yes, but not now. Towards the end.
All right. Well, the media plays the role that it plays. It's basically spinning the story in a way that makes it acceptable to the public, and it's part of this fundamental problem. You got to understand, I think, the role of the media. The aid policies that have dominated the country since neoliberalism began in the 70s, the rise of the question of security, all these things are connected, and they're bound up with issues around class and the securing of privilege and property, basically. And there really is a systematic reason for this, and we need to talk about it before we dismiss. It's not about the American military taking over, it's about the military taking over. Key thing is that the government that was elected and was popular in the 90s abolished the army, and ever since it did that, the privileged few in Haiti have been nervous that they would lose those privileges and that the great majority of the people might be empowered and could threaten them. And that's been the driving agenda for the last 15 years.
And can I ask you all to test this fact? You asked that we bring up the structure, the pre-existing structure of Haiti. Is it the case that the French-speaking Creole minority have most of the wealth? Is that undisputed?
No. The Creole is spoken by everyone. As a common language. The elite speak French and English as well, but everybody speaks Creole.
And who has most of the wealth?
The light-skinned, multilingual minority in Haiti.
And Peter, you're nodding. Is this something that you think is important we must discuss?
It's fundamental. To simplify, as you say, and it's important to simplify things, Haiti's problem is very simple, which is how do you maintain the most unequal distribution of power and wealth in the entire region? Right. If you measure it in terms of Gini coefficients or anything you like, Haiti is off the charts. It's not just the poorest place, it's by far the most unequal. So how do you maintain that? Well, in slavery, you did it through a plantation system. At different periods in time in Haiti's history, they've had different strategies. Duvalier did it with paramilitaries that killed tens of thousands of people. The thing is, in the late 80s, that popular mobilization basically found a way to overcome the kind of traditional military structure. And in the context of so-called New World Order and so on in 1990, there was a shift in strategy. And the people, for the first time, elected a popular government that had a massive popular majority, and it set about trying to dismantle the system. And basically that's what's been happening ever since. And the army responded first with a coup in 1991 with American support.
Cedras.
That's right. Aristide comes back, he demobilizes the army. So the army's gone. What do you then do when Aristide and the people around him are re-elected with a huge majority of the vote? This is the crucial thing to know, is that in 2000, the last serious elections you had in Haiti, one party, a bit like the ANC in South Africa in terms of its popularity, won 90% of the seats in parliament. Every seat but one in the Senate. It had 75% of the vote. Massive landslide. And these people had a moderate but nevertheless progressive agenda for social change about empowering the majority of people. This was certainly the project. And what happened to them? Well, all international aid was cut off, a kind of economic embargo designed to destabilize the country, to destroy the economy. A paramilitary group on the Contra style was launched in, with clear, I think, support for the United States. And this has set in motion a process that led to a coup in 2004 that overthrew that government. And hang on, just to finish. And ever since then, the right wing in Haiti has been trying to re-establish the army, and the UN has been largely fulfilling that function until the US arrived.
No, and I was just going to make a historical point that probably takes us slightly off of the tangent, but you can't absolve Aristide, who was the guy who won this massive majority. You can't absolve him of responsibility for the state of things today.
Okay,
and that wasting his mandate.
All right, and that is a tangent, although historically very important. Now, to you two in the middle and back to the audience. So now we've introduced a new layer to this discussion, which will end, I promise you, on time. That we've given an American view, and the audience has reacted. We've said that the international response is extremely fractured. There's a coordination problem, and with good reason. The UN building collapsed. The government collapsed. Now we're being told across the panel, remember this is a class-ridden society where maybe 1 or 2% control all the wealth. That the earthquakes come into this situation. Suddenly everything has changed. So just bring us back to the present. To you, Astrid, Claire, and to you, Christian, is this getting completely to the question of how the aid is going to where it's going, who's benefiting from it? Is this exactly what's happening at the moment on the ground?
Is it exactly what?
In other words, that these pre-existing structures of inequality, is that something of how we should be viewing the situation and coming to an understanding of the problems of reconstruction?
I think there's a big risk that this will just reinforce what's already been there. And that's, I think, is where especially the media, instead of just being complicit, has a role to play in talking about what could be done differently and putting different points of view across, and especially ahead of the donor conference at the end of March, the Haiti donor conference. There needs to be much more reporting about what could be done differently, for example, how rural Haiti could be becoming part of the reconstruction effort, because otherwise it will just lead to the same inequality and poverty issues that they have been dealing with.
Claire and Peter are both nodding with you.
Yes, I think a few observations here. One, to come back to the question, is coordination the right framework, or is it more about leadership and decision-making and setting the principles for what are the priorities and what needs to be done? And a huge question here is the one of fairness of distribution. And does this mean that the same amount should go to each community, or does one take those which are most excluded, most hit, most subject to poverty, and give them more? And has there actually been that type of discussion amongst whichever the leadership is, the government, the UN, about those set of principles, a robust discussion? And I think as well, back to this question of coordination, in so many contexts around the world, you have this aid rush of thousands of NGOs, dozens of agencies, with the best of intentions, incredibly dedicated people taking risks, trying to do good. But is this system serving the very people they're trying to help? Have we got something of, Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex for good reason, but have we got something of an aid complex, an aid which is allied to lobby groups, allied to Congress, and there's interest? And do we actually need a movement from the left as well as the right to question what are the interests here, and how do we need to think about reform of this, so the people who are professing to help really do get to help the people in question?
Absolutely. I think leading on from this, I think that just goes to show that the Haitians need to somehow be able to take charge of the process, and that is tremendously difficult since the government is very incapable now just in terms of its infrastructure, and it needs to enable Haitian civil society to be heard. And I think the real challenge now for journalists is to look towards Montreal, towards the New York conference at the end of March, and to see what kind of politics are being promoted there and what policies. You know, some of you will know that famous Professor Collier from Oxford was transported to Haiti last year for 3 days. He came up with a plan which was duly adopted by the UN, which is now being implemented by a Special Envoy Bill Clinton, which revives, you know, 30 years of failed development policies in Haiti, whereby we are trying to promote, you know, a cheap labor production line, free trade zone recovery, which has led to massive influx from the rural areas into the city, and which has created, you know, this massive situation of need, you know, and actually this massive death toll, because people need to be enabled to live in the countryside, to have a future in the countryside, to have food security, food self-sufficiency, and slowly then build a domestic market. Haiti needs to be allowed to raise its tariffs to protect its imports. All this stuff you will hear nothing about when we come to New York, unless, you know, people give a voice to actually, you know, the peasant cooperatives, the women's groups, all these people in Haiti who are now struggling to be heard.
And forgive me, Christian, I did call you Peter. So everyone in the room has kindly come with the sentence, we're discussing Haiti in advance of the rebuilding of the donors meeting to rebuild. So I propose to, in the 30 minutes that's left, to ask us to move on to the rebuilding of what would the panel do at the conference, the donors conference, to aid rebuilding. Now, before I do that, is there anyone who wanted to pick up on what we've heard and felt very moved by, or I heard there was an aid complex here, and I saw some faces in the audience nodding. I heard also that there was inequality and that needed to be addressed, that was pre-existing, and I'm going to move on unless you want to pick up on any of those remarks that you heard, anyone at all in the audience. Okay, fine. So rebuilding. Now, Claire, what is your, we're going to lose you, but one of the things you are most interested in of all the panel is this rebuilding. Why is that? What does your organisation do? And what 2 or 3 messages would you give to the donors conference to rebuild? And what's your experience in your organisation for telling us?
Certainly, we've looked at where efforts at rebuilding have been successful in other contexts. I'd approach this with a great deal of humility. The immediate task of hand is to save lives and is to attend to the urgent. So it seems, you know, when it's appropriate, and it may not be now, to look at the medium term and the long term future, what are those lessons? And I think I'd very much agree with Christian. It's how do we, instead of so many times the international community assumes that there's nothing on the ground and we have to bring everything in from the outside. Now certainly sometimes money is needed or advice is needed, but how do you switch that around and actually look, really understand what is the context, what are the assets that exist already on the ground in terms of the people who live there, their knowledge, their preferences. I think one of the lessons is it's the policy frameworks that are developed on the ground through consultation with civil society, through government and what's left of it, and that allowing that process to be emergent from the leaders on the ground, and then being pretty rigorous about accountability of the domestic public financial system, but really we need to be much more rigorous about flows of money from the donor community. Often it's sort of, you feel, why should we provide accounts when we've got to save lives? I completely understand that. Attend to the urgent tasks at hand. But I think as donor countries, we've got to ask for higher standards of accounting and auditing, because I think the time is over when we can look at the UN agencies and NGOs and say, they don't have to provide us accounts and audits, because that's when we get these billions of dollars missing, and then a lot of anger and resentment later on.
So do you want an audit of what's available and working in Haiti, and is that going to be, should that be done before the donors conference? And would anyone in the audience like to comment on this? I've seen some reactions. Would you like to know, and who from, what's working in Haiti?
I think one of the things to be agreed perhaps at the donor conference is what should the standards of accountability be? In the modern age, it's possible to have all the accounts online. Why can't the citizens of Haiti have access to how the money's being spent and why the decisions are made? That's technically possible. You know, why don't UN agencies issue their accounts? A couple of other observations then is how, you know, this principle of fairness of distribution. I think one of the things the conference could address is, you know, how is money going to be distributed across the territory and across the citizens? You know, is it some experience in some countries, National Solidarity Programme, Afghanistan, a block grant to communities. Let them decide, let them make the decisions at really local level, and then finally to address this question of job creation and market building. What type of economy and livelihoods is the country going to look forward to?
I mean, there are no computers, there's hardly electricity. What's the point of putting accounts online?
Not at the front end in the humanitarian phase, but if we're looking to the longer term reconstruction period,
But you want this as a priority in March. Put the accounts online.
Not as a priority March in terms of the urgent at hand humanitarian, but the extent to which March will look at medium to long term. It's about asking that when it comes to, so say a particular NGO or agency or private company is given $200 million to do X.
Okay.
At some
follow the money, basically.
Follow the money. At some point, they should be obliged to put to make available to citizens of Haiti, of citizens, the taxpayers, how they spent that money.
Okay, the conference is in March. What's on your list?
Well, let me start off by saying that the role of journalists in reporting this tragedy and fostering greater understanding of it has been properly criticized. But one of the things that the BBC is doing, they've established out of Miami a Creole-speaking service to reach all levels of Haitian society. It's lifeline broadcasting. It's saying, for example, Paddy, there's a hospital half a mile from where you live to tend to your wounds, or there's a shelter 3/4 of a mile from where you live to get your water supplies. And hopefully that is going to be an integral part of the rebuilding process. The bigger questions around rebuilding, it's important for the people who are contributing towards the rebuilding of Haiti to have a clear understanding of where its priorities lie. There's been a lot of talk about debt write-offs, because, but honestly, that isn't the pressing problem for Haiti right now, because the level of its debt servicing is relatively low. Much of that has been delayed. A large proportion of it is being met by the US government. The thing that keeps Haitians afloat is remittances, and you have got to make sure that those channels of money flowing into the country remain open. You've got to ensure that the aid pledged is properly accounted for. That's very, very important. And you've got to make sure that it reaches to all sectors of society. I'd just like to make a quick point about the inequality. In terms of the loss of life, this has been an equal opportunity tragedy, because anyone who knows Port-au-Prince could see that some of the areas of biggest devastation have been the rich areas where the United Nations headquarters were, where some of the strong, the multi-story concrete structures were. It's ironic in that the more flimsy your structure, the better the chances of your surviving a building collapsing in Haiti. But the equality problem has got to be addressed. Just one quick thing. The majority of Haitians have nowhere to go. I spoke to a friend of mine. I called her right after the earthquake. What are you going to do? She said, well, I've sent the kids to Miami, but I have to stay here and stand guard over my business and bury my parents. The vast majority of Haitians don't have that option.
Right. Okay. Now, to members of the audience, then, there's a donors' conference coming in March, and we could discuss what they might discuss. Would you like to tell us perhaps your specialty and your name?
My name's Claire, and I've just finished working for Save the Children recently. I think it's interesting that you talk about aid being the need for auditing of aid, because the majority of aid agencies on the ground in Haiti believe that Haitians should make the decision for themselves. They're not actually a bunch of foreigners. So Save the Children, my former organisation, is actually comprised in Haiti of 3/4 of its employees are Haitians. They're not foreigners. And the British public sort of forget this all the time. The foreigners who are on the ground believe that Haitians should be given cash more often than not, more often than aid packages. They should be given cash grants so that they can make the decision of what exactly they need. And that may be a flat pack to build a temporary shelter. It may be food, it may be clothes for their children, it may be school fees. They want to get their lives back up and running immediately. But I feel that aid agencies are maligned quite a lot because they're really not these didactic, Western, alien organisations with no contact with the locals. They're comprised of locals.
Did you feel there was anyone in particular on the panel who was bashing the aid agencies?
I feel that it's in the British media, it's in the British mindset that, and maybe probably all over the developed world, that aid agencies are comprised of foreigners who parachute in, know nothing about the country. Save the Children has been on the ground for decades. So it's essentially a Haitian organisation with foreigners who've arrived recently.
And with your experience, what would you do to try and what would you get on the agenda in March? If it's about rebuilding, what would you put on the agenda?
Well, I think it comes back to this question of cash grants. Aid organisations, the Disasters Emergency Committee, made up of 13 British aid organisations. The majority of those organisations believe that Haitians need to be given cash grants, get their lives up and running in the way that they see fit. They prioritise what they need with that money.
Astrid?
I think that's a practical solution to the problem, but on the other hand, if you are given cash and there's not necessarily much to buy with it, then maybe that's not so helpful in the immediate aftermath.
But there's a lot of
a disaster.
Agricultural output. I mean, the farms across Haiti, outside Port-au-Prince, are functioning. There's a lot of food being produced. Now that local market needs to be stimulated with cash, local cash.
No, it's a very practical solution, I think. I wanted to add something to the agenda for the donor conference, which I think in terms of accountability, where does the aid goes, is very important. And that would be to foster a strong local media sector and an independent media sector. And it was quite amazing how within 24 hours after the earthquake happened, local radio was up and running. I think only initially 2 stations. One of them broadcast by generating electricity of a car. You know, it was pretty amazing. And I think this is really, if you have a strong and independent local media, those questions will be asked. You know, where does the aid go and where doesn't it go?
Can I add some facts I researched that before the earthquake, radio was Haiti's most important information medium. Access to the press was limited by low literacy levels. There were more than 250 private radio stations, 50 FM broadcasters in the capital alone, with all the political views. Self-censorship was common. Journalists tried to avoid offending commercial sponsors or politicians. And Reporters Without Borders said press freedom had improved dramatically after the fall of Aristide. But it warned in 2007, Reporters Without Borders, that impunity for attacks on media workers could continue in the absence of an effective justice system. So we know we don't have a justice system. If there is going to be reconstruction, what would you say, in addition to saying to the donors in March, get radio going, get press going, how deep would you go about this question of securing the freedom of journalists to tell uncomfortable truths on the radio as this is going on?
I think that is a problem. They could, of course, be subject to violence or attacks, but I think it's also...
Or death.
Or death, even worse. But it's also an issue where you actually give local people a voice to say something on local radio, you know, rather than have the journalist tell what it is like and what it should be. Give local people a voice to make their own programs.
So perhaps phone-ins, perhaps, you know, and you think this would be a really effective way? I mean, it sounds pretty effective to me, but I'm just looking for the audience to react as well. Astrid, of all the things on the agenda we could have, you say that journalism and radio should be really high up on the list.
Yes.
Well, you're speaking to an audience of journalists, and no one seems to be shaking their head.
I would say that.
So, to you, Christian.
Yeah, I'm just going to say one more thing in terms of the political conditions for successful development long term. And I think that there needs to be a debate about decentralization. It's been promised since the 1987 Constitution. It's never been properly made a reality. I think in addition to the sort of the cash grant thing is not a bad idea, I agree with it, but I think aid, the massive intergovernmental aid needs to find its way to local authorities, to regional authorities, and especially given the high level of illiteracy, the problems of communication. Radio is therefore very important, I totally agree, but you need to have local accountability of local officials. So if the local population knows that the mayor got 10 million to do X, then he can be held accountable. The big problem, I think, coming now towards the conference is to ensure that the Haitian government makes a commitment, and I think that would be intelligent conditionality, not the conditionality that we know about neoliberal privatization of everything, but to say actually if we give you 200-300 million, Haitian government in Port-au-Prince, will you make sure that this money actually goes to local authorities?
Peter, you're going to tell me in a moment what you'd put on the agenda. To the audience again, please give us your name and what your specialty might be.
My name's Brian Condon, and I feel a bit nervous speaking in this audience because I don't have any expertise in this area.
We're together.
All.
You and me are together, Brian.
It just seems odd to me that when we have our own financial earthquake in the West, we spray money at the problem. $50 billion, $100 billion, and we just keep pumping the money, fiscal stimulation, all that kind of stuff. And yet when something like this happens, we sit about and talk about auditing and the need to ensure that donor money is well used. Well, it just seems to me to be kind of balmy to be thinking like that. And I speak absolutely as someone who is ordinary. I don't know anything about the region, and I came here to find out what experts think. And it seems to me you don't bloody know. Okay?
Now, would you like to be personal and say which one of them?
I'm going to tar them all with the same brush. What I didn't get a sense of was whether you think the initial response was A, valid, and B, efficient. And if the answer to that is no, why should we think that the subsequent response of rebuilding and reconstruction should be any more efficient or effective? And I haven't got a sense of that from the panel. I've got a bit more from the audience, and I'm even more confused now than when I got here, which I didn't think was the point.
No, it certainly isn't the point. But thank goodness you said that at 8 rather than 8:35 when you were leaving. Peter, the charge is, if it was badly spent aid from a recalcitrant, group of aid organisations and governments, what will happen in the future? And would you answer his confusion?
Sure, I'll try. I think the initial response was an absolute disgrace. It was a scandal, and if it continues, unless massive political pressure is put to change it, it'll continue that way. If you look what happened in the last year, basically. Preval, the president, who basically does what he's told, he did two main things. In addition to banning, his electoral council banned the most popular political party from participation in elections.
Okay,
but he did two main things.
So let's accept your first statement, which is that the response was disgusting and terrible, which is what I think that's what ordinary people in the UK think.
Do you think it?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I think it's a scandal.
Right. So
and I cannot understand how the world's superpower can deliver nothing, which is what we think. And I'm happy to say it might be completely wrong. But let's just accept your first statement. So, it was a terrible reaction to it, and it didn't work. Why should we be confident, if we give money now, that the response in reconstruction, rebuilding will be any better? What would fill me with confidence?
If we give it in the conventional way, we shouldn't have any confidence. I think you're absolutely right. You should be absolutely skeptical.
And nobody said that.
But there is an alternative. The alternative is to put pressure from people who have the influence outside Haiti and the people who can influence the situation from within Haiti to change it. So just look, there are a couple of things that can just be reversed. So for example, Preval last year continued a privatization program that's been on the agenda for 15 years, catastrophic policy. He's trying to sell off, and basically has sold off, the most valuable public asset they've got, the phone company. And just in fact, a week before the earthquake happened, a big part of this deal was agreed. That's a disaster. It should be stopped immediately. A second thing they did is he refused in the summer to increase the minimum wage to $5 a day. This was passed overwhelmingly by both houses of parliament. He refused it in August. 2 months later, in October, Clinton says there's going to be a new free trade zone, as Christian was saying, outside Port-au-Prince. It's clear he was told to do this. That's a disastrous policy. Again, I agree with Christian very much. So to go back, your point about the cash question is absolutely right. One friend of mine said, that the earthquake, and then you have the tsunami of aid, which is wiping out the local economy. What's happening is all this free food, quote unquote, is coming. It's destroying local farmers, etc. I agree with that point. On the other hand, the aid structure.
Okay, wait with me. We're on this point at the moment. Yeah. Are you hearing what you're asking for?
Well, we're getting a bit closer. Yeah. I mean,
well, go on. Keep going.
Okay. Well, look. Let's look at one theory. Let's say that we take a few lorry loads of cash, stick them in the back of a Hercules, and chuck them out the back of the aeroplane as it flies over the city.
Right, you've already admitted you're not an expert.
No, I'm not.
And now you're telling us to drop cash from an aircraft.
Well, at least it would be evenly distributed.
Okay.
Yeah, well, no, it won't. The strongest will get more. We'll get more.
No, hang on. Let's go up the panel. I think you also made a very serious point, which is that please educate all of us with your experience,
Yeah, but I think that's just a different type of cash grant, slightly more chaotic and won't work so well. But I think seriously, I want to continue where Peter left off. I think what we are saying to the conference in New York is, and what I said before, is that we have had 30 years of just the same development policies over and over again. And it is uncomfortable for the West to hear this, but the fact is that this is driven by our agenda. We want to have cheap jeans. We want to have cheap computers. Exactly. That's what can be cheaply assembled in Haiti, and it does not provide the Haitian economy with a growth opportunity because there's very few cross linkages there. Stuff comes in, stuff goes out, and no money is left in the country. So hence we need to develop a local market. It's not about aid, it's about Haiti being allowed to raise its tariffs, to protect its agriculture. We all did that. That's how we developed. We were all agricultural societies in the beginning, and we have to allow Haiti to develop its own model.
Yes, I don't think we can have very much confidence that the reconstruction process will be better than what's just come before it if the same paradigm, if the same practices are used. There's a report which can be found online, written a couple of years ago by the National Academy of Public Administration, called Why Foreign Aid to Haiti Failed. Quite an extensive documentation of the previous decades of what's gone wrong. Billions and billions spent with no discernible impact on social exclusion, on the alleviation of poverty. Having said that, I think there are examples. Billy Stilly, a professor at New University, is trying to look for them, the sort of searching one. There are some examples around the world of where aid has been successful, and I think this block grants, 28,000 villages in Afghanistan, 80,000 villages in Indonesia, one example of success. Give a block grant of $20,000 or whatever it is to each village, light guiding principles, and let them spend it is one such example.
And are you hearing what you wanted to hear now?
I've got a clearer picture now of what you might be able to say to the donor conference that might make a difference. So yeah, that's helped. Thank you.
And we haven't heard from Astrid yet, so you've got the golden goose coming in a second. Hang on, but just I don't know if it's too personal. Have you given money? You're a British citizen, are you? Have you given money to the disasters?
Yes, I have.
So
yes.
If I may say, so have I. So what? So we've given out of a sense of what? When you gave, what did you want to happen? I could tell you, but no one's interested what I wanted. What did you want to happen with your own money?
I took part in some events. Some of the London geek community did events and raised money, which went to the DEC, and that happens quite a lot. And there's stuff happening this weekend as well in the kind of geekery around London. But I don't know. I mean, it's because I felt I had to do something, and I didn't really know what to do, so I gave the money to the DEC. Now, was that a good thing to do? I don't know.
Well, we'll ask the audience, but to the panel, was our friend Rodney? Brian, sorry. Was Brian... It's from a sitcom. It's from a
name to start with. Like, give me another one.
Was Roger right to give money to the DEC? Was I right to give money to the DEC? Astrid, Peter, you're saying no. And then the audience, please join in on this, because we've only got 20 minutes and we will end on time. Astrid, was he right?
difficult question, really, because, yeah, how do you know it really goes to the people on the ground that really need it? I think that's always the question when you give to emergency appeals, you know, them depending on how you gave the money, it might mean it doesn't even get there for another few months, and so there are question marks over it. But I do understand the need in people, how they want to help, and this is a practical way for ordinary people, forgive me when I say ordinary, I mean people like all of us, to do something what they think might help people on the ground.
I'm going to do something that we journalists hate. Answer a question you didn't ask. The question, Brian, the questions that you posed before, was the response good enough? No, it wasn't. Can we be any confident that going forward it'll get better? No, we have no assurances that it would. But what is the alternative, Brian? To not give aid? Is that what you're saying? What? No, it's a partly a rhetorical question. What is the alternative? You know, a critical question here is the fact that Haiti doesn't have a government. René Préval has had a serious abdication of leadership during this earthquake crisis. He's living in a private residence. He refuses to go out into the street and engage with his people, reassure them, hold their hand, or give them any information about anything. So at the moment, there's no functioning structure for the distribution of aid. That has got to be fixed. But you can argue that over the past century, Haiti hasn't had a properly functioning institution.
Okay, keep it moving. Peter?
Quickly, it doesn't have a functioning government because we've destroyed it. We overthrew
Okay,
it.
but that's not where we were, though. Are we right to give money?
Yes, two concrete things. You should give money to the right people. Give it to an organization, for example, like Partners in Health. This is an organization grounded mainly in Haiti. It has an office in Boston as well. Why? Because, first of all, they're an exemplary organization. They perform really fantastic work. And they're also geared towards ultimately shifting whatever the hospitals and so on that they build into the Haitian Ministry of Health, for example. One of the crucial things we have to do is not give money through NGOs, which appropriate a great deal of the money for themselves, fragment it, distribute it in ways that reinforce the privilege and hierarchy in Haiti, but instead invest in something like a national health system for Haiti. What kind of national system do we want in a country like Canada or Britain or wherever it is? You want a solid, consolidated public system with the same system for everyone. That's the first thing. The second thing is I agree with you before. You said the question is not so much about debt. That's right. The question is, what do we owe Haiti? I put on the agenda the question of, what does the United States, what does France owe Haiti? France, for example, owes a vast amount of money to Haiti. And this question of the colonial debt is a long story, but there is a well-documented and important question. What does the United States owe Haiti? A lot.
But that's not a runner. It's not practical. They're not going to get that.
Why not?
It's not a runner.
Why not?
And to the audience?
Why not?
Sorry, me again.
Don't be sorry, you're here. Say what you mean.
It's not specifically about Haiti, it's kind of more in general. I've just made a film about Partners in Health, actually, and the difference between them and what we're talking about is that they're a social enterprise. They're not an NGO, they're not a charity, they're a social enterprise, so they operate according to business principles, which means they have audits, which means they operate in a completely different way. And what I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet at the moment about this whole kind of media scramble with all the aid agencies in Haiti. And I was wondering, Brian, sorry to bring you back again.
Rodney.
Bob. Let's say you gave 20 quid. How would you feel if that 20 quid had gone straight into the press office in London to promote the NGO and what they were doing on the ground?
Pass the microphone to the lady next to you.
I will in a minute. She's a friend of mine.
No.
just for the record,
I'm not talking about Save the Children.
Save the Children has 2 press officers in Haiti at the moment. It has 200 aid workers, so it's a minuscule.
So your friend is leading us up a blind alley.
But this person is not being paid. This press officer is not being paid out of donors' money. This press officer is already on the books.
Okay, bear with me. We're going to lose Claire from the panel now. Claire, I will allow you 1 minute, if you wish it, for something you bursting to say. You've kindly given us many of your opinions, but I know you want to leave at 8:15. We're going to leave at 15 minutes after you. Is there anything you must say which you didn't have a chance to say in response to our audience or into what your panel members have said, your fellow panel members have said?
Well, I think this is an excellent discussion, and from the audience comments as well, covering the key issues. But the one point to reiterate again, I think, is for the donor conference and for the process moving forward, especially in light of the problems of the government and governance, what's the right process to get the citizens of the country, the civil society groups on the ground, engaged in the process of defining their own future? And how does the international actors who desperately want to help be on hand to provide the help that's asked for, but hang back from trying to dictate what Haitians want for their own future? And I think that, to me, is one of the critical questions.
But that's what they used to call aid without strings, isn't it? So we give money, but we don't ask, we let the Haitians decide how they spend the money that has been given.
To some extent, but it's not just a question of a blank check to an unaccountable government.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with you, I just want you to say it.
Yeah, so it's sort of that, but it's not a blank check to an unaccountable government, it's finding the right process for Haitian civil society to be engaged in the right way.
So we give money without strings?
No.
No, we give money when there's signs of accountability.
We get the partnership right between what is needed from the outside, and that will include money, it will include expertise, it will include some goods that aren't available in the local markets, but it's finding the right partnership with civil society on the ground.
Okay, and goodbye. Thank you very much. We're going to lose Claire. Thank you very much. To the back.
I'm Julie. I've introduced myself already, but it's a question for the panel, because when I was looking through for the video at the beginning, I was quite interested. There was a fair bit of reporting, not from the UK primarily, about the whole issue of private companies, and some suggestion that there's been a fair amount of business put out to tender already, and just in looking ahead to the conference, is there anything that will be done? I mean, I don't know, is that part of a conspiracy? Is that a sort of, what are those tenders for? Is there something at the conference that could be done about it? Is there going to be a kind of opportunity for people to make a lot of money out of this, that sort of at other people's expense?
Astrid, sorry, we haven't heard from Astrid for a while, but everyone can have a say. But we're going to wrap up in about 12 minutes. Astrid?
Not really sure about that one, I'm afraid.
Okay, good. Peter?
I don't know about the details in March, but it's not a conspiracy. It's been explicit policy for a long time to privatize electricity, water, the ports, telephones, and so on. It's been, one of the crucial documents is the Paris Accords in 1994. You can find them in Multinational Monitor, August 1994. They're all listed, and this has been an agenda that's been, broadly speaking, pushed ever since. And it's not a conspiracy. And the people who are going to do it are you can identify the families. The Meuves, the Brandts, the Accras, the Noels. These are, you look at rice, for example. Rice used to be a thing that thousands of people produced. Christian already referred to this. It was something that distributed income relatively fairly across a large sector of Haitian society. Now, neoliberal policies basically put all those people out of business. They went into the slums. They're exploited for dirt cheap wages, $1.75, $2 a day. And now 3 or 4 families import all the rice. They charge a surcharge on top of it, and they make a ton of money. That's the kind of thing that's been happening. We have to break these kinds of things. The question is, it's not about giving aid without strings. It's about giving aid to the right people.
Yep.
We can all agree it should be about Haitian people, but are we going to be, or will we support a process in which there's something like genuine popular collective decision-making and empowerment? And that's been the thing that happened in Haiti. Haitian people did this themselves. That's what the Lavalas movement was. And that's why this question of politics, this movement has been systematically smashed. It's been smashed by things like right-wing churches, NGOs, paramilitaries, and so on. Why? Because they divide and the rule it, they split it. Our question, I think, has to be: are we on this question? Whose side are we on?
And on the Peter Hallward list, you would have a new form of administration, a new form of government on the list for the donors conference. You won't be able to achieve rebuilding without rebuilding democracy.
I would put the question, just like if you go in somewhere like Cité Soleil, Justin mentioned this already, a poor, very poor place. The first thing's got to be, do you have a system in place whereby the local people there can actually make the decisions themselves? And there are popular organizations, so-called, in every district in Port-au-Prince, and that are perfectly able. It's happened a few times here. When they're given aid, they can distribute it with no problem. They have the discipline, everyone knows who's who. It's very easy to do. You just have to trust people a little bit. So it's extraordinary. Take a place like Cité Soleil. This is some of you will have heard of it, no doubt, because it's the notoriously most impoverished, most quote-unquote dangerous slum. Orin starts a report saying, enter at your own risk, as you know. This is a place where for 5 years the UN's been there with a huge budget and a huge amount of soldiers. 611 million was the budget this last year. almost all of it spent on military purposes. They've done nothing in the city of Sile. This is a place without running water, without rubbish removal, without electricity for most people. It's got one overworked hospital that's woefully inadequate. What has the international community and the aid community done?
Right.
Zip.
And on that, so what could you put on the donors conference agenda that would be better?
You could invest in the public system for all these things. An adequate public water supply, for example. Instead, what happens is trucks go, all kinds of middlemen, they charge about 15 times the price of the water. Put in a public water system. Put in public education, public schools, public health. These are all things that could be done with a strong central government. I'd also say it should go on the model of something like the Cuban literacy drive. You mobilize people for their own, for the investment in their own resources, using their own strength. That's the way to go.
Yeah, following on from that, I think the important thing is to be less lazy in the international donor community, to say, right, it's an easy thing for us to give a contract to the MOVs, we know they have got all the lorries, they'll do it, and that perpetuates a constant social injustice there. The intelligent conditionality is to say to the Haitian government, will you commit, to give the money to, the local authority, in Carrefour, and, demand that they tender properly, i.e., they're not giving the contract to the MOVs, willy-nilly, but are there local initiatives, are there local groups, are there local small entrepreneurs, who we can get involved, and that will ultimately break the cycle.
Yeah.
So Julie, does that answer your question at all? It sounds like micro projects may be on the list. Would that be fair to start some projects with seed corns, or?
I think that's right. I think that must be right. Yeah.
Hello, Antonia Landine, just as an observer, just like this gentleman, wanting to learn about Haiti. What I'm concerned about, no one has talked about the children and the protection of the children. Will that be covered at the donor conference? These children are so vulnerable, and it looks like anybody can just about get in there and walk off with them, like we've seen with these religious groups from America.
And there's a lady nodding here. Would you flesh out what you mean? Before you lose the microphone, you would like the donors conference to target money at child protection?
Not just necessarily money, but to have somebody taking care, a group, an umbrella group, taking care and responsibility for some of those vulnerable children that have been affected from the earthquake.
Astrid, can we expect the donor conference to say they have ambitions in certain sectors of the community in that way, children by age? Would that be something that's likely to be on the agenda in New York?
I think it could well be on the agenda, but the question is, what group could be doing this? You could say, okay, there's UNICEF, there is Save the Children, and I think it's already there. They're already doing that. So it's not like there's nobody taking care of the children at all. We had unfortunate things happening, or these Americans coming in saying, oh, let's take 150 off the street. But I think there is already a drive there to protect children, and the UN has already said quite a lot about protecting children.
But whilst everyone's talking about it, there's very little happening on the ground. The very fact that these people could come in and take them away, okay, they might have had the best of intentions, but there are other sort of people wanting to traffic in children, paedophiles in other countries, just turning up because of the chaos and being able to just walk out with these children.
I think they definitely take advantage of the chaos,
yes.
And I think it again boils down to not having an effective central government. There's no structure in place really to enforce that sort of protection, and this is really where the UN could take a leading role in enforcing that better.
Okay, so we're going to move to the final 5 minutes or so, and I get an impression from some members of the audience, we arrived hoping to take something away, perhaps to say what the New York people need to do, and also whether or not we understand the obstacles in Haiti. And I think during the evening you've given us a clear sense of the obstacles, but I wonder if on behalf of all of us in the audience we would like to know something from you that could be put into a program or put on the agenda that we could go away in our work and say to people, we've heard people with great experience tell us what they must do in New York. So I'll ask you to do that in your closing comments. Does anyone in the audience have anything to say by way of a closing remark? Have you come and are you at risk of leaving disappointed if you don't say or hear something? Because we will move to the close in just a second. Okay, fine. So, Christian, tell us something that we can leave with the room saying, this is one thing that could be on the agenda?
Well, I think the most important thing is a new agreement on development policies in Haiti. I think the long-term picture must be the most important one, and the decisions will start in New York. If we follow the old model of sweatshops, of giving the Mervs, the Brunts, all these people the contracts to rebuild Haiti, then we have more of the same. So I think that must be the most important message, to say to the Haitian government, how are you going about putting a structure in place whereby the majority of the population benefits, and that's the conditionality we want to see.
Thank you. I think the aim for the donor conference should really be to push for a structure that doesn't repeat policies that lead to further inequality and poverty.
Is that on the agenda? How is that framed on the agenda?
How is that framed on the agenda? I think it needs to be at the top of the agenda. It doesn't need to be framed on the agenda. It just needs to be the overriding principle. If you want to be making an effort to rebuild Haiti, it has to be based on those principles.
A fresh start.
Well, if you want to use that buzz phrase,
I'm just
good old journalist here.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Well, first I'd say, as a principle, it's wrong to think of it in terms of Haitian weakness or Haitian incompetence or corruption and so on. You've got to see it in Haiti's poor because it's been strong. It's been, if Haitian slaves overthrew slavery themselves, the only time that happened, Haitian peasants or small farmers were able to resist primitive accumulation, or they weren't pushed off their land. It's really the only place in Latin America where that happened at a systematic level. It's the place where in the late 80s, at a time when places like Nicaragua and so on were being pushed further and further to the right, there was this incredible popular mobilization that overthrew an army that fought these Makuts and paramilitaries, that overcame that resistance with extraordinary courage and really remarkable levels of discipline and organization. And it happened again after another coup in the 90s. I think that if you think about it in terms of what people can do, the capacities there I think are really remarkable. And it's got to be about that. It's got to be about facilitating and enabling popular power, popular strength, and taking away some of the obstacles, mainly the army. The army's the real problem. What'll happen now, someone raised the question of privatization, that's going to happen. It'll happen also with the influx of other, and it's been happening for years, but more and more private security firms and companies, probably pressure to reestablish the Haitian army in conjunction with the American and the UN forces. This will be a disaster. So to stop that and enable instead something like the will of the majority of the people to prevail in the face of privileged interests that will resist this every inch of the way. That's guaranteed. Yep. So I think we have to take sides. Do we want to favor this? Do we want to encourage it? Do we want to invest in this? That would be a political choice. I can guarantee that the United States government and its allies will not make that choice unless they're forced to do it. And the other thing I would say is I personally think the question of debt has to be raised in terms of what we owe Haiti. France does owe Haiti a huge amount of money that you can document, that you can make a very strong case over. Aristide demanded that money back in 2003. It's one of the reasons why it was overthrown. And that's an important case. The United States owes Haiti a ton. It's behind 2 coups. It's colluded in the killing of thousands of people. It destroyed huge amounts of public resource. It's been driving a neoliberal aid policy that's destroyed the government again and again. It owes Haiti a lot. I think we should talk about that.
Sorry, Peter, but reparations is dead in the water. It ain't gonna happen.
Just like Hillary Clinton has to come in rather than us, that's the way the world is. We got to change the world then.
That is the way, and absolutely we do have to change the world.
Well, let's change it then. Stop saying it has to be that way. Let's change it.
I agree that the big macro questions around rebuilding Haiti have got to be answered. We need to empower Haitians. We need to improve civil society. We need to improve the local government structures. And Christian made a very powerful point about how some of the aid responsibility is sort of tendered out. That is a very, very critical question that needs to be addressed. But the most important and overriding questions is that right now lives are being lost, and that is the thing that has to be addressed. And we absolutely don't have to get the structures right before we react. We should recognize that aid delivery is an imperfect science. There are always going to be points of criticism about it, and sometimes reacting and then working out whether your structures are 100% effective is the best way of going about things. I'd like to carpet bomb the country with cash, but we know what's going to happen there. The best connected and the strongest people are the ones who are going to get their hands on the cash.
Okay, well, let's call it to a close there, but we shouldn't say that you in the panel are in the dock. You're very much helping us understand things, and on behalf of everyone listening, can I thank you for trying to answer these unanswerable questions of what to do in Haiti. I've certainly learned a great deal, and thank you to our audience as well. Several times in the evening, you saved the whole evening, and I can look in the audience and see many faces, so thank you for participating, but principally on behalf of us listening, thank you to our panel, Orin Gordon, Astrid Zweynert, Christian Wisskirchen nearest me, and Peter Hallward there. Thank you very much.